So, Netta, you've been working on conflict transformation, and a huge part of that field's intersection with journalism is the need to really have difficult conversations.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting as we were hearing more about nonpartisanship and the role of bipartisanship, and I was reading something interesting recently about multipartisanship and this idea, and kind of inviting in the complexity. That's a huge component of what we explore within conflict transformation, is just trying to imagine the same issue from as many possible perspectives as you can in order to identify that common ground and move things forward, as opposed to saying you're either with me or you're against me, which I think can be really inspiring. Yeah.
Absolutely. Common ground is necessary, especially if we, again, are really going to be moving the planet forward. We actually had our correspondents do an experiment this year to explore those ideas of deep listening and of reaching out to understand, right, conflicting viewpoints, and again, having those difficult conversations. So George Washington University correspondent, Paul Leone, which I think is over there, interviewed a farmer from Brazil who's advocating for looser protections in the Amazon rainforest so he can expand his cattle ranch. We also had Teesside University correspondent Danny Nicholson, a wave, I can't see, maybe out there, who went out and interviewed people on the street of his hometown who hate the idea of having a sustainable hydrogen energy facility being built in their own backyards. And then we also had GW correspondent Maggie Rhoads talk to a lobbyist who believes that we need actually more fossil fuel investments, and that it's the rest of the world's responsibility, not America's, to bring down emissions. Let's take a quick listen.
Let's let the private sector come up with the next great technologies that are low emission or technologies that can reduce or remove emissions.
You have been arguing for a deregulatory way to approach climate change, but where is the compromise? Where are you willing to compromise on what you stand for?
Yeah, I actually wouldn't call it a deregulatory agenda. We think of modernizing the regulatory system. So we think there has been, and maybe it started around that time, maybe before, a false narrative of fossil energy versus renewable energy. And we think that's a false choice because fossil energy doesn't cause climate change. The emissions from them do. And so it's really a global challenge. It's not just eliminating emissions in the US. That wouldn't really solve anything.
All right, everyone. Good transition to difficult conversations. So I want to welcome the panel out. We're going to have a lovely group of students come and discuss. So we have Maria Jose Vargas from Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And we also have, yes, Danny Nicholson from Teesside University. And Maggie Rhoads from George Washington University. We saw Maggie doing a wonderful job of just being neutral, taking things in and story listening. So I thank you all so much for being on the panel. We're very excited to hear from you. So yeah, our panel is focused on difficult conversations and trying to think about how we might frame both the stories that we're hearing, the stories that we're listening to, and the stories that we want to share. So if each of you could just do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll get moving.
So hi everyone, my name is Maria Jose Vargas, and I am a graduate student at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, focusing on environmental policy and management. And I'm a Planet Forward correspondent.
Mm-hmm.
Hi everybody, I'm Danny Nicholson. I'm a student at Teesside University studying sports journalism. I'm also a correspondent at Planet Forward as well.
Hi, my name is Maggie Rhoads. I'm a student journalist at George Washington University studying journalism and political science. And for Planet Forward, I focus on environmental policy.
Great. So yeah, as we were discussing earlier, this idea of multipartisanship, but also the role of neutrality and thinking about the common ground as we're building out difficult conversations. And as I mentioned earlier in the morning, this idea of the kind of the spectrum of allies. So thinking about everybody that you're talking to as either like actively aligning with you, maybe actively opposing you, but also those who are neutral, and how do you kind of move the needle here and there as you're sharing your stories. So we'd love to hear from all of you about the role of Common Ground. We've been hearing about that throughout the day. Common Ground is a huge component of conflict transformation work and trying to identify, do the work to figure out what do we see similarly, what values do we hold in common, and then how do we then have that relationship building in order to move in the aspirational direction. So if each of you could share about your experience finding Common Ground, either in terms of the stories that you share and or with those that you've interviewed. So Maria Jose, if you don't mind going first.
So in my story, I interviewed an expert on multicultural engagement. So I didn't have to necessarily find common ground with her. Well, or we had it naturally, but the reason I interviewed her is I wanted to get her insight on the tensions that occur due to cultural diversity in the, international climate negotiations, basically the conference of the parties of the COP. So I think maybe, right, like I think finding common ground in the COP is something that not happens right now, but that I think is necessary. And I was actually listening to a podcast recently on the importance of finding that common ground before representatives of the different parties go into the COP, right? And I think all the parties or the countries that agreed to the Paris Agreement are in agreement of the objective of stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions globally to a point where it's not harmful for living beings, right? And how each country chooses to do that, or the strategies that they do that, we may disagree or agree with, but I think it's something that does not happen right now in this space, but it's necessary. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Danny. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for my story, interviewed a historian called Dr. Tosh Warwick, and he gave me a lot of sort of common ground before I interviewed the people of Redcar. And he sort of gave me a context into their history and why they might feel a certain way, and why they might be opposed to the hydrogen project that was being put in place in their town. And that came in really helpful when I went to interview the people of Redcar, because then it sort of helped me empathise and sympathise with their views as to why they might feel that certain way, and why they might be slightly against it or against new things that the government might want to put in place because of the history of sort of government wrongdoing in their town. So that really helped, and I think that showed in a few of the vox pops that I did in the conversations that I had with the people from Redcar.
Lovely, thank you.
All right, so for my story, as everyone saw, I interviewed Luke Bowler of ClearPath, which is a conservative climate organization advocating for innovation over regulation. And personally for me, when I was interviewing him, I knew that he's a highly qualified individual. Before he joined ClearPath, he worked in the offices of Representative Steve Scalise. And yeah, so he has a lot of experience like on the Hill and with environmental policy. And for me, even though he might say some things that the majority of people who advocate for climate change disagree with, I know that he is a highly qualified individual. So for me, for me, with him, I'm like, okay, well, I want to remain neutral, whenever I'm talking to him, especially within environmental policy or politics, because although being an activist within storytelling is something that is really important, also recognizing when you're reporting on something highly contentious, you want to make sure you remain as neutral as possible, so that people in your audience are able to understand the story from a very neutral and nonpartisan position, so that they can make their own opinion.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think it's interesting, this idea of common ground. For some of you, it sounds like it was like a starting place for you. Like, let me identify the common ground with the people that I'm engaging with, and then potentially with my audience. And for others, it's like common ground is the goal, so that's kind of the both and of, that for the COP, that there's many people who believe the same thing about the goals, but then how do you get there is the question. So it was interesting to hear how each of you kind of have been thinking about common ground in relation to your own work. So it's a good segue actually to thinking about, and Maggie, what you were mentioning also about this idea of the role of the storyteller, right? So we were looking at that earlier about activism, advocacy, truth-telling, education, et cetera, and who are we in relation to the stories that matter to us. We asked you all earlier to think about the conflicts that are most important to you, and then try to identify, what is your connection to them, right? And so these debates out of these tensions around am I neutral? I'm not neutral. When I'm interviewing somebody, do I mute my positionality in some way? So I wonder if each of you might be able to speak to that to some extent about those kind of tension points and how you've navigated those across the stories that you've shared. So if you don't mind, Maria Jose.
Yeah, so I think something that the person, Jackie Oliveira, who's the expert that I interviewed for my story, something that she shared in order to navigate this was what she calls kind of like 3 golden rules, right, of building trust or creating trust when you're dealing with someone from different culture as yours. And it's number 1, like getting to know yourself, right, understanding your cultural tendencies, and that could be the way you communicate, your communication style, how you disagree with someone in a more direct or indirect way, how you make decisions, right, like all these characteristics are very cultural related, so understand yourself and the cultural traits that you have, then learning about the other person or persons' culture as well, and how they interact or how they land in these elements that I was mentioning, right? Communication, decision, disagreements, etc. And I think doing that exercise will allow you to identify your biases, right? When you're engaging with another culture, right, and kind of map out those, this is correct or incorrect, or maybe if the person's doing that differently, I don't necessarily trust them, or et cetera, right, like doing that exercise before of understanding your culture and the other person's will allow you to not engage in those biases, yeah.
Yeah, when I was interviewing the people from Redcar, it sort of struck me as whether I should be the person to educate them as well, because it made me question my role as a journalist. Is it my place to be neutral, or is it my place to educate them? Because I think as a journalist, I think it's important to stay neutral while still sticking to the facts, to not spread misinformation or disinformation. So I think when I was interviewing the people from Redcar, I chose to keep a neutral stance, just to hear what they had to say and their point of view, and let them express what their experience is. But while interviewing experts, I think it's important that you challenge them in a respectful manner if you think they're wrong on a point. So any sort of experts that I would interview, if they sort of went off track to something that I didn't think was quite right, I think that's important. And I think as a role as a journalist, it's your duty to sort of challenge the experts who are sort of spreading wrong information, because they are in a position of power over the people of, for example, in my story, Redcar. So in that sense, it's important to make sure the people in positions of power are spreading the right information, and the people are getting the facts, the real facts of why this is a good move to make into hydrogen power in this case, and why it's better for the people of Redcar, and what it could mean for the future.
Great. Thank you.
So personally for me, when covering climate change, it is a fact that climate change is real. It is a fact that climate change is happening. Where the disagreements lie is the solution to climate change. Some people might advocate for solar panels and tax credits. Other people might advocate for increasing walking trails in communities. It's so different regarding the solution for climate change. So I think for all of our experts who we talked to, including Luke, they all believe in climate change. It's just the solution and getting there that's all different. So personally for me, I don't think that anything that people or experts might be saying is wrong. I just think that we have our own inherent biases about what the solution to climate change is, whether it's how we were raised, what's impacted our communities, anything else in between. So that's just my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think also the tensions that at sort of when you're framing your story, when you're engaging with people around the story, and then how you tell the story and how to navigate those, and how each of you have sort of makes decisions along the way about, okay, and for example, how many of you when you were watching the video of Maggie earlier had a reaction, right? Either you verbally said something to a partner, or you gasped, or you internally were like, really? And then you're like, I should look that up. Or, each of you had some kind of reaction to it, right? And so in the moment, you're making those decisions about how do I want to engage? Is this the moment? If I do this, am I going to lose rapport with them? Are they going to close down, et cetera? And so thinking about how we kind of train ourselves and before we begin to proactively imagine, I do have biases and I do have my own agendas, and how do I navigate that along the way? So, and there's not necessarily one right answer, but we each kind of clarify that ourselves. So just for the last question, if each of you, we have just a few minutes left, if each of you could highlight a little bit more about this role of either linguistic, cultural, contextual awareness. That's a huge component as we kind of map conflicts and try to analyze the players and the stakeholders and the positions. If each of you might share a little bit about that role of either linguistic, cultural, contextual awareness as it helped shape your story process.
Yeah, I think in my case, again, and I maybe already mentioned this a little bit, but it's having that awareness, and my story was focused on, again, tensions in the CUP, where you have around 200 representatives from different parts of the world, very culturally diverse space. So having that awareness when you are coming into that space, that it's very culturally diverse, so that is gonna come up in how representatives communicate, how they make decisions, how they navigate the negotiations, and yeah, it's important to check the biases that you may have regarding different cultures when you go into those spaces for the negotiations. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think for me it was really important to speak to Dr. Tosh Warwick beforehand, before I interviewed the people of Redcar in my piece, because he gave me so much of that contextual awareness behind Redcar and the difficulties they went through. Like, being from the local area, I sort of already knew it, but he gave it such a deeper meaning, and that really connected with me when I was sort of interviewing the people of Redcar as well. Because they used to be like an epicenter of industry for steel and coal, and then it was government decisions that basically shut that down and has sort of sent Redcar in a bit of a deprived state at the moment. And now they are sort of against decisions being made by the government to implement hydrogen power. So for them, it was like, why should I trust what you're doing when you've basically ruined our town and everything that we stood for and all that heritage that they had? So it was important when I was interviewing them to sort of understand that, yeah, they've got reasoning behind why they're against it on a governmental level, because they feel they can't trust the decisions being made for the better of their town.
Sure, yeah, thank you. We just have a minute left. Yeah, no, if Maggie, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to note, when I interview Luke, or when I interview someone who's like can be like contentious or say things that I personally disagree with, I always make sure to keep like a poker face in a sort of way. But it's not that I didn't try to push on him. If you read the full article that I wrote on Planet Forward, like, I made sure to push him on, like, yeah, but like, where's the compromise? Because he was all about very firm in his stances, but there's not going to be a climate solution if there's no compromise. But personally, for me, in terms of like how like my community and like my background shaped my climate reporting, I actually grew up in an area that is like a cancer cluster. The EPA shut down a like medical cleaning factory that was spewing like harmful chemicals into the environment. Like 3 of my mom's friends have had cancer, like my sister's friends have had cancer. So personally for me, when I'm reporting, that's really what shapes like my inherent biases, and that's what I try to like tune into to help like combat my inherent bias.
I appreciate that. Thank you all so much. This balance of curiosity and persuasion, that's so core to what everybody's doing, but also recognizing that we come to these issues with commitments and our own positionalities, and how do we, those are our guiding principles, and then how do we make those decisions along the way. So I want to thank you all so much for sharing so openly, and thank you to the audience. And I think we're moving on to our next segment. So thanks, everybody.